The silence did not fall. It arrived. It moved through the studio like something alive, slipping between the lights, settling into the seats, pressing gently against every chest in the room until even breathing felt too loud. Cameras were still rolling. The audience was still there. The stage lights were still burning hot against polished floors and painted smiles. But the moment had shifted. Keanu Reeves sat in his chair with his hands resting loosely in his lap, posture relaxed in the way of someone who had learned not to guard himself with tension. There was no performance in him, no rehearsed charm, just stillness. And yet something in his stillness felt alert, as though some inner sense had quietly warned him that a line had been crossed, not aggressively, not cruelly, but unmistakably. The host offered a polite smile, the kind that lives halfway between professionalism and nerves. "Keanu," he said lightly, trying to keep the moment conversational. "After everything you've lived, everything you've seen, who do you love?" It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. And yet it struck the room with the weight of something that could not be taken back. For years, the world had spoken about Keanu Reeves as if he were an idea more than a man. The humble one, the kind one, the quiet one. The actor who rode the subway, who gave without cameras, who grieved without spectacle. People admired him, but admiration had slowly turned into ownership, as if gentleness made a person public property, as if a soft voice invited intrusion. Tonight, in this carefully designed space of applause and entertainment, millions leaned closer to their screens, waiting for something simple. A name, a headline, a confession. What they did not expect was resistance. Not sharp resistance, not angry resistance, but the kind that grows out of respect. Keanu did not answer. He lowered his eyes slightly, not in discomfort, but in reflection. The pause stretched longer than television was comfortable with. Someone in the audience shifted. A few nervous laughs fluttered and died quickly. The host almost spoke again, then didn't. Because this was not hesitation. This was deliberation. And in that quiet, something deeper than a broadcast moment began to surface. Keanu had learned long ago that love was not something to be announced. It was something to be carried. Long before fame, long before red carpets and studio lights, loss had taught him that the most important things rarely survive when they are handled like entertainment. That real connection did not grow in noise. It grew in privacy, in loyalty, in the unseen choices no one applauds. The world had watched him grieve, but it had never truly seen how carefully he protected what remained. Across the studio, unseen by the cameras, Sandra Bullock sat off stage. She was not scheduled to appear. Her name was not on the segment rundown. She was there quietly, as she often was lately, having come not as an actress, not as a guest, but as someone who understood what it meant to live under a spotlight that could warm or burn depending on the day. Their connection had never begun loudly. No grand announcement. No strategic debut. It had grown the way real things often do, through shared history, through long conversations that wandered far from careers and returned to something simpler. Loss, laughter, exhaustion, hope. Two people who had spent decades being looked at and very little time being truly seen. Sandra had known Keanu in many seasons of his life. She had known his humor. She had known his gentleness. She had also known the spaces in him that rarely filled no matter how much success surrounded them. She did not watch the stage expecting to hear her name. She watched knowing he was standing inside a moment that did not belong to television. Back in the chair, Keanu slowly lifted his gaze. When he spoke, his voice did not try to soften the room. It grounded it. "That's not a simple question," he said quietly. A few people smiled, waiting for humor to follow. "It didn't. Because love," he continued, "isn't something you say to satisfy curiosity. It's something you live to honor responsibility." The room shifted. Not dramatically. Internally. The host blinked, the audience stilled. The silence changed from suspense to attention. Keanu didn't speak faster. He didn't decorate the moment. He allowed it to breathe. "I love kindness when it costs something," he said. "I love resilience that doesn't need to announce itself. I love people who stay when there's nothing to gain." Somewhere behind the lights, Sandra closed her eyes briefly. Not from emotion. From recognition. because she knew exactly what those words came from. Not a headline, a history. The audience waited. They always did. But the reveal never came. And that absence unsettled something deeper than disappointment. It unsettled entitlement. The idea that because a life is visible, its heart must be accessible. That because a man is admired, he owes explanation. Keanu didn't refuse the question. He reframed it. And in doing so, he took control of something the world had slowly tried to claim. The segment ended in applause that began uncertainly, then strengthened, not because people had been entertained, but because something human had passed through the room without costume or performance. As the cameras cut away, conversations ignited instantly online. Some praised him, some criticized him, some accused him of avoiding, others defended him fiercely. Very few understood what had truly happened, because the silence that filled that studio had not been empty. It had been protective. And protection, in a world that profits from exposure, is often mistaken for defiance. What no one yet realized was that the question had not ended. It had only moved. Away from a stage. Toward real consequences. Toward quiet choices. Toward a test that would not ask who he loved, but whether love could remain intact when dignity became inconvenient. And when that test arrived, Sandra Bullock would no longer be watching from the shadows. She would be standing directly inside it. The backlash didn't explode like a bomb. It arrived like fog, quiet, steady, and everywhere at once, rolling across timelines and headlines until it felt like the whole world had decided to stand a little too close. In the hours after the broadcast, the clip of Keanu's answer traveled faster than context ever could. People turned his restraint into a puzzle, then a sport, then an accusation. Some said he was noble. Others said he was evasive. But the sharpest commentary wasn't even about him. It slipped sideways, landing on Sandra like a shadow that didn't ask permission. Her name began appearing in speculative posts, in body language breakdowns, in confident threads written by strangers who had never met either of them, yet spoke as if they had access to private rooms and private promises. It was the familiar cruelty of modern curiosity, a hunger that pretends it's entitled to clarity simply because it can shout loudly enough to demand it. Sandra felt it before anyone told her. She didn't have to read every comment to know the temperature had changed. She'd lived long enough under bright lights to recognize the exact moment admiration starts turning into ownership. Her phone remained face down most of the evening, not because she was afraid of what she'd see, but because she refused to let strangers decide what her peace would feel like. Still, the noise found its way in through other doors, an assistant's worried tone, a friend. Are you okay? Text, an agent leaving a careful voicemail that sounded like concern, but carried the faint, unmistakable scent of strategy. The industry did what it always did when sincerity threatened to disrupt the machine. It tried to smooth the edges until everything became safe, predictable, and easy to monetize again. And in doing so, it revealed how few people could tolerate a boundary when it wasn't theirs. Keanu, for his part, moved through the next day the same way he always did, quietly, deliberately, without the dramatic posture people expected from someone trending worldwide. He went to a small meeting early in the morning, one of those commitments that had nothing to do with premieres or publicity, and everything to do with being useful in ways the camera couldn't reward. He listened more than he spoke. He nodded, asked simple questions, offered help without turning it into a statement. But even there, in a room filled with practical people and practical needs, he could feel the pressure creeping at the edges. It wasn't just the public anymore. It was institutions, the polite, organized version of control, moving behind the scenes with soft hands and hard expectations. Invitations began shifting. Schedules became flexible. Meetings were suddenly being reconsidered. It wasn't punishment in the obvious sense. It was the slow, subtle attempt to teach him what happens when you don't give people what they want. That afternoon, Sandra met him in a quiet place away from the noise, not a glamorous restaurant or a private club, but a small, almost ordinary cafe tucked into a street most people never photographed. It was the kind of place where no one expected a headline to walk in, where the chairs were worn in familiar ways, where the air smelled like coffee and fresh bread instead of perfume and performance. She arrived first, chosen a corner seat, and waited with an ease that looked simple from the outside but had been earned through years of learning which battles deserved her breath. When Keanu stepped inside, there was no dramatic greeting, no moment crafted for an audience. He simply sat across from her, and the calm between them felt like a language they'd been speaking for years. For a while, neither of them mentioned the broadcast. They talked around it, the way people do when they're protecting something fragile, not fragile because it's weak, but fragile because it's real. Sandra asked about the meeting he'd attended, about the cause, about the people who'd spoken. Keanu listened as she described a project she'd been considering, something meaningful but uncertain, something that mattered enough to scare her a little. They moved through the conversation with a gentleness that wasn't romantic in the dramatic way tabloids like to sell romance, but intimate in a deeper way. The intimacy of being able to show up without pretending. Eventually, Sandra set her cup down and looked at him with the kind of honesty that doesn't need sharpness to be powerful. She didn't ask why he hadn't said a name. She didn't tell him he should have. She didn't fish for reassurance. Instead, she asked the question that mattered more than the one the host had thrown at him. She asked, "Are you okay with what comes next?" Her voice wasn't anxious, just clear, the way a person speaks when they've survived enough storms to recognize when the wind is shifting again. Keanu didn't answer immediately, and in that pause she understood he was doing what he always did, weighing truth carefully, not because he was scared, but because he respected how much truth can cost. "I'm okay," he said finally, but his eyes didn't pretend it was easy. "I'm just tired of watching people confuse access with love." Sandra nodded, and the nod carried years of her own experience with the same confusion. She knew what it felt like to have your humanity treated like an open invitation. She also knew what it felt like to be misunderstood because you refused to turn your private life into entertainment. She leaned back slightly, then said something softly that landed heavier than a speech. "They don't know what you protected last night." It wasn't a compliment. It was a recognition of values. And Keanu's expression shifted, the way someone's face changes when they realize they're not alone inside a burden. Their conversation might have ended there quietly if the world had been willing to let the moment fade. But the world didn't fade. It escalated. Within 2 days, a high-profile charity gala announced its guest list publicly, and Keanu's name was right where everyone expected it to be. Near the top, polished and prominent, positioned as proof that the event represented compassion and moral leadership. It was, on paper, a celebration of humanity. It was also broadcast live, decorated with applause and celebrity speeches, the kind of night that loved to call itself meaningful. The invitation arrived in Keanu's inbox with formal warmth and careful language, and when Sandra saw it, she noticed what he noticed instantly. There was no +1, no mention of her, no space for the possibility that he might arrive as someone attached to a real person rather than as an individual symbol meant to decorate their cause. The organizers framed it as standard procedure when Keanu asked, calmly, without accusation, whether guests were permitted to bring a partner. The reply was polite, almost friendly, but it carried a message under the surface, one of those messages people pretend isn't a message until you call it what it is. "We're keeping the evening focused," they said. "We want to avoid distractions." Distractions. The word was clean, the meaning was not. It suggested that the presence of the wrong person could tarnish the image. It suggested that some relationships were acceptable and others were inconvenient. It suggested that their version of compassion came with conditions. Sandra didn't tell Keanu what to do. She didn't need to. She could see his mind working not in rage but in clarity. She had seen him choose peace over ego 1,000 times, but she also knew the difference between ego and principle. Ego wanted attention. Principle demanded consistency. And Keanu's stillness, the same stillness that had quieted a studio, now tightened into something firmer, more resolved. He didn't threaten them. He didn't call journalists. He didn't announce a boycott. He simply said, "Then I can't go." The simplicity of it almost stunned Sandra, because she knew how rare it was in that world to see someone step away from a stage without turning it into a performance of virtue. But the system doesn't like clean refusals. It can't argue with them. It can only try to pressure them into becoming messy. Calls came in. Polite ones first, then more urgent ones. People who hadn't spoken to Keanu in months suddenly wanted to check in. People who cared more about optics than truth warned him about how it might look. Someone even suggested carefully that he should attend alone for the good of the cause and handle the rest privately. Sandra listened as Keanu described these conversations, and her jaw tightened not in jealousy or fear, but in a quiet anger at the hypocrisy. The same people who praised kindness loved it only when it didn't inconvenience them. The same people who preached unity practiced exclusion with perfect manners. Then, on the third evening, the turning point arrived in the form of a different invitation, one that didn't come through email or a formal assistant, but through a message from someone who didn't speak the language of Hollywood at all. A community center on the edge of the city was hosting a small benefit event for families rebuilding their lives after a disaster. No live broadcast, no red carpet, no scripted speeches. The director of the center had met Keanu once years ago briefly and remembered him not for his fame but for how he'd listened. The director wrote simply, "If you have time, come sit with our volunteers. They're tired. They could use hope, no cameras, no expectations." Keanu read it, and something in his face softened in a way Sandra recognized. It wasn't relief. It was alignment. It was the feeling of being invited into something real again. They decided to go together quietly without announcement, without a publicist shaping the narrative. Sandra wore a simple coat and kept her hair pulled back, not as a disguise but as a refusal to perform. Keanu dressed the same way he always did, comfortable, unremarkable, calm. They arrived after dusk, when the sky had turned dark and the air carried that cold clarity that makes voices sound sharper than usual. Inside the community center, the lighting was warm and uneven, the walls lined with handmade posters and faded photographs of past events. Volunteers moved quickly, setting up chairs and serving food, the kind of coordinated chaos that comes from people doing their best with limited resources. When Keanu walked in, there was a ripple, not a celebrity scream, but a surprised pause, the way people react when kindness arrives in unexpected form. Sandra stayed close, not clinging, not hidden, simply present. A few people recognized her and froze, unsure of what the rules were for being around someone famous without being rude. But Sandra smiled gently, and something in her expression gave them permission to relax. She asked a volunteer where she could help, and within minutes she was carrying trays, stacking cups, listening to a woman describe the exhaustion of rebuilding a home while trying to keep her children from feeling the fear. Keanu sat at a table with a group of teenagers who had been volunteering after school, and he didn't talk at them. He asked them about their lives. He looked them in the eyes. He laughed quietly at a joke one of them made, not as a celebrity laughing for the crowd, but as a man sharing a moment with another human being. And then it happened, the moment that would change the shape of everything. A teenager, maybe 17, with tired eyes and a voice that carried the blunt courage of youth, looked at Keanu and said, "Can I ask you something?" The room around them didn't go silent because no one was filming, but the people at the table stopped moving. Keanu nodded once, giving the kind of permission that feels like respect. The teenager swallowed and said, "Why do they keep asking who you love like it's their business?" The question was not cruel. It wasn't demanding. It sounded genuinely confused, like someone trying to understand why the world needed to possess what it admired. Keanu didn't answer fast. He glanced briefly toward Sandra, not as if he needed approval, but as if he was acknowledging her presence in the truth he was about to speak. Sandra met his eyes with calm steadiness, a silent message. "Be honest, but be you." Keanu turned back to the teenager and spoke quietly, not as a lecture, not as a public statement, but as one human explaining a hard lesson to another. He said, "Because some people don't know how to respect love unless it's packaged for them." He paused, then added, "And some people confuse curiosity with permission." The teenager nodded slowly, absorbing it. Keanu continued, his voice low but clear. "Love isn't proved by naming someone in front of a crowd. Love is proved by how you treat people when there's nothing to gain, by how you protect someone's dignity even when it costs you comfort." Across the room, Sandra felt her throat tight, not because she needed to hear herself implied in his words, but because she understood what he was doing. He was teaching the room a new standard without accusing anyone. He was giving them a way to grow without shame. And the people listening, volunteers and teenagers and exhausted parents, didn't react like a studio audience craving drama. They reacted like human beings recognizing something true. They didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They simply breathed deeper, as if the air had finally been given permission to move again. Later that night, as they walked back toward their car, the street quiet and the city humming in the distance, Sandra said softly, "That was the real answer." Keanu looked at her, a faint smile touching his face, and he said, "It's the only one that matters." They stood there for a moment, not romantic in a theatrical way, but close in the way two people are when they have survived enough noise to value what stays quiet. Sandra could feel it, the sense that their private choices were now becoming public lessons whether they wanted them to or not, because authenticity, once seen, is hard to unsee. What they didn't know yet was that someone inside the community center had filmed a short clip, not of a scandal, not of a confrontation, but of Keanu listening to that teenager and Sandra helping quietly in the background. It would be uploaded later with a simple caption, "This is what real humility looks like." And it would spread faster than the gala ever could, not because it was polished, but because it was undeniable. The system that had tried to control the story would soon realize it couldn't compete with truth that wasn't performing. And when that realization hit, it wouldn't retreat gently. It would push harder, test sharper, and try to force them into a narrative that could be sold. Because when a world built on spectacle meets someone who refuses to perform, the next thing it tries is pressure. And the next pressure would not come from strangers online. It would come from someone close enough to make it personal. The clip didn't go viral the way scandals go viral. It didn't arrive wrapped in outrage or framed by accusation. It spread quietly, passed from one person to another with messages like, "Watch this," or "This felt different," or simply, "This helped." In the grainy footage, there was no dramatic soundtrack, no perfect lighting, no camera angle designed to elevate anyone into a symbol. There was only Keanu sitting at a folding table in a modest community center, leaning forward as a teenager spoke, his attention so complete it made the rest of the room feel irrelevant. And in the background, almost out of focus, Sandra moving gently between people, setting down cups, listening, placing a hand briefly on someone's shoulder in a way that asked for nothing in return. The internet, accustomed to being fed spectacle, didn't quite know what to do with it. But something in the image resisted being turned into noise. It felt like truth, and truth has a way of unsettling systems built on performance. Within 48 hours, the narrative shifted, not dramatically, subtly. Commentators who had confidently dissected Keanu's evasion on the talk show began walking back their certainty. Articles reframed the earlier silence as intentional rather than awkward. Viewers who had never cared much about celebrity stories found themselves unexpectedly moved, not by romance, but by example. People shared their own experiences of being judged for relationships that didn't fit approved images, of being pressured to explain private bonds to public audiences. The story was no longer about who Keanu loved. It was about whether love owed anyone proof beyond decency. And in that shift, something dangerous began to happen for those who had tried to shape the narrative. They were losing control of it. Sandra felt the change in the way strangers looked at her. Where there had once been curiosity edged with entitlement, there was now something softer, almost cautious, as if people were suddenly aware that she was not a character in a story they could edit at will. She noticed it in the messages she received, not from industry contacts, but from ordinary people. Women who wrote about being told their relationships were inconvenient. Men who spoke about choosing loyalty over approval and paying for it quietly. Young people who admitted they were tired of feeling like their private lives existed for public judgment. Sandra read some of them late at night, sitting on her couch with a blanket drawn around her shoulders, not because she needed affirmation, but because she recognized the relief in their words. They weren't thanking her for being famous. They were thanking her for being visible without being available. Keanu saw the change differently. He felt it in the rooms that suddenly became smaller around him. Meetings that once flowed easily now carried tension beneath the politeness. People who had celebrated his humility began to worry aloud about his direction. He heard phrases like brand alignment and public expectations, as if his character were a product that needed recalibrating. One afternoon, he was invited to lunch by someone he had known for years, someone who had once spoken passionately about values and authenticity. They met in a quiet restaurant, and for the first half hour, the conversation stayed safely on the surface. Then carefully, almost kindly, the other man leaned forward and said, "People are starting to attach things to you that you didn't used to carry. You might want to clarify. Give them something simple." Keanu listened without interruption, his expression calm. When the man finished, Keanu asked one question quietly without challenge. "Clarify what?" The man hesitated, then said, "Your position." Keanu nodded slowly. "My position," he repeated. "On being human." The question landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. The man tried to laugh it off, but the conversation never fully recovered. They parted politely. But Keanu walked away with a deeper understanding of how uncomfortable people become when you refuse to reduce your life into something easy to digest. The true pressure arrived a week later, wearing the face of opportunity. A major studio reached out about a high-profile project, one designed not only to succeed but to shape narrative. The role was meaningful, the platform enormous, the potential reach vast. It came with the usual praise for Keanu's integrity, his connection with audiences, his unique moral presence. And then, folded neatly into the offer like a clause in fine print, came a suggestion, not a demand, not an order. A suggestion that future promotional activities might benefit from clearer storytelling. That audiences, they said, responded better when they felt included in an artist's life. That mystery, while intriguing, could become misinterpreted. The implication was smooth and practiced. Openness would be rewarded. Silence would continue to complicate things. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He thanked them, said he would consider the project, and ended the call. He sat for a long time afterward, not because he was tempted by the condition, but because he was saddened by how easily principle became negotiable when wrapped in ambition. When Sandra joined him later that evening, he didn't repeat the conversation word for word. He didn't need to. He described the feeling instead. "They don't want honesty," he said quietly. "They want access." Sandra sat beside him, listening, her hands folded in her lap. She knew that feeling well. She had lived long enough to recognize when doors open not to invite you inside, but to see how much of yourself you were willing to give away in order to walk through them. She didn't advise him. She didn't reassure him. She said something truer than both. Whatever you choose, they're going to call it something. You just have to decide if you're willing to let them name it. Keanu looked at her then, really looked at her, and in that moment the noise outside felt distant. He wasn't deciding between a role and a refusal. He was deciding between two ways of living. They went for a walk later, not to be seen, not to be photographed, but because movement helped them think. The city was quieter than usual, the air cool, the streets lit in that soft, indifferent way that cities light themselves when they aren't trying to impress anyone. They talked about ordinary things, about projects they wanted to do that no one would headline, about places they missed, about the strange way fame could make you feel both surrounded and unseen. At one point, Sandra laughed softly at something small and unimportant, and Keanu felt again the truth he had been circling for weeks. That whatever the world decided to call this, it already knew what it was. It was companionship without transaction. It was loyalty without announcement. It was the kind of connection that doesn't beg to be believed because it doesn't depend on belief to exist. The following morning, Keanu declined the studio offer. He did it politely, respectfully, without drama. He thanked them for their confidence, expressed appreciation for the project, and said he wasn't the right person for it at this time. The response was swift and courteous, and beneath it, unmistakably cold. Within hours, other opportunities that had been warm days earlier began to cool. Calls were returned more slowly. Conversations that had felt open became cautious. It wasn't exile. It was conditioning, a quiet attempt to teach him what it costs to remain undefined. Sandra felt the ripple too. A project she had been informally attached to suddenly shifted direction. Nothing explicit was said, but she had spent decades in the industry. She could read the movement of doors as clearly as language. There was no anger in her, only a familiar sadness at how often spaces that celebrated empowerment were unwilling to practice it when it threatened convenience. That night, she admitted something to Keanu she hadn't spoken aloud before. She told him she was tired of rooms where worth was measured by how easy you were to manage. She told him she didn't regret any of it, but she no longer had the patience to pretend that silence always meant peace. Keanu listened, and in his listening was an answer more solid than reassurance. He wasn't standing where he stood because he was unafraid of loss. He was standing there because he knew which losses were survivable. The world, however, was not done testing that resolve. The next wave didn't come from institutions or executives. It came from someone closer to the story, someone who had shared history with both of them, someone the public trusted. An interview was released unexpectedly, framed as reflective, nostalgic, harmless. In it, a familiar figure spoke about past years, about friendship, about moments long gone. And then, casually, almost wistfully, they spoke about Keanu and Sandra. About how complicated things had always been, about how people don't always see what's really there. The words were not cruel, they were worse. They were ambiguous. They invited speculation without taking responsibility for it. They reopened narratives that had never belonged to the public in the first place and handed them back to the crowd as something to debate. The effect was immediate. The clip was replayed, dissected, interpreted. Commentators built stories from tone and phrasing. Social feeds reignited with questions, theories, and confident conclusions based on fragments. It was as if the world, having been denied a simple answer, had decided to manufacture one. Sandra watched the coverage one evening, not glued to it, but aware of it in the way you are aware of a storm forming somewhere beyond the windows. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came when your past is repackaged as entertainment without your consent. She turned the screen off and sat in the quiet, allowing the emotion to move through her without becoming something louder. When Keanu joined her, she didn't summarize the interview. He had seen enough. She said instead, "They're going to keep telling versions of this whether we speak or not." Keanu nodded. "They always do," he replied. "The question is whether we start telling one too." That was the first time the possibility hung openly between them, not as a demand from outside, but as a choice from within. Sandra didn't rush to answer. She leaned back thinking not about reputation, but about fatigue, about how long they had both been carrying the weight of other people's projections, about how much energy went into not reacting. She said finally, "If we ever speak, it shouldn't be to correct them. It should be to protect something." Keanu understood immediately. He wasn't interested in a reveal. He was interested in drawing a line the world could see, not to invite it closer, but to ask it to stop. They didn't decide anything that night. They didn't script statements or plan interviews. They let the idea rest between them like something alive, something that needed time to become honest. Outside, the conversation about them continued without their help. Inside, something was changing. The earlier silence had been about refusal. This new quiet was about preparation, because they both felt it now. The story had reached a point where not speaking was no longer neutral. It was being used. And the next step, whatever it was, would need to be taken not in defense, but in intention. What neither of them yet knew was that the pressure was about to intensify in a way that could not be managed privately. A major public event was approaching, one that would place them both in the same space, under the same lights, in front of an audience primed by weeks of speculation and half-stories. And this time, the question would not be asked by a host or a teenager or a headline. It would be asked by circumstance itself. And circumstance, unlike interviews, does not accept rehearsed answers. The event had been on the calendar for months, long before silence turned into speculation and speculation into pressure. It was framed publicly as a celebration of service, a gathering meant to honor humanitarian work across industries. The kind of evening built carefully for cameras, where emotion is curated, speeches are timed, and narratives are gently guided toward applause. Keanu had agreed to attend early on because the cause itself mattered. Sandra had been invited separately through a different channel, not as an accessory, not as an extension of his presence, but as someone whose work and reputation stood firmly on their own. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have been a simple coincidence. Now, after weeks of shifting narratives and sharpened curiosity, it had become something else entirely. It had become a convergence, and both of them felt it long before they spoke about it. They discussed it one afternoon in the quiet of Keanu's living room, sunlight slanting through wide windows, dust drifting slowly in the air. There was no urgency in their voices, no dramatic framing, only the honesty of two people acknowledging that a moment was approaching that would not remain contained. Sandra sat on one end of the couch, her hands loosely folded, her posture relaxed but attentive. Keanu stood near the window, looking out not at the view but at the thought beyond it. He said finally what had been forming in both of them. "They're not going to let this night be about the work." Sandra nodded, not in resignation but in clarity. She understood that spaces like these rarely tolerate ambiguity when it threatens their ability to package a story. They want symbols. They want angles. They want something to point to. And if you don't give them something carefully shaped, they will take whatever shape they can make. "What do you want this night to be?" she asked him quietly. The question wasn't strategic. It wasn't about public relations. It was about alignment. Keanu didn't answer right away. He crossed the room and sat in a chair opposite her, leaning forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees. "I want it to be honest," he said, "and I don't want honesty to hurt anyone." Sandra watched him, the seriousness in his expression, the absence of performance. She felt again the thing that had drawn her into this space with him in the first place, the way he treated truth not as a tool, but as a responsibility. She said, "Then whatever happens, we don't let it turn into spectacle." He met her gaze and nodded. They were not planning a declaration. They were preparing to protect the tone of whatever unfolded. In the days leading up to the event, the atmosphere around them thickened. Media outlets previewed the evening with language that leaned just a little too hard on anticipation. Commentary speculated about whether they would be seen together, whether something would finally be clarified. Even well-meaning acquaintances reached out with gentle curiosity, disguised as support. Sandra handled it the way she always had, by narrowing her world rather than trying to manage it. She kept her routines simple. She went on long walks, she cooked, she read, she spent time with people who spoke to her as a person rather than a story. Keanu did the same, finding steadiness in ordinary commitments, in small acts of usefulness, in conversations that didn't orbit around what the world thought he owed it. Neither of them said much about the night itself, but the understanding between them deepened. They were not walking toward a moment that would define them. They were walking toward a moment that would reveal them. The venue was grand in the way grand venues often are. High ceilings, warm lights arranged to soften edges, polished floors reflecting the movement of guests who had learned how to inhabit spaces like this without appearing impressed by them. As Keanu arrived, flashes followed, names were called, polite questions were offered. He moved through it calmly, greeting people with the same gentle respect he always had, but he could feel the undercurrent beneath the formalities. It was not hostility, it was appetite. People weren't angry with him, they were interested in him. And interest, when fed too long without boundaries, becomes invasive. Sandra arrived separately, greeted with her own wave of recognition and admiration. She moved through the room with ease, but she was aware of glances that lingered a fraction longer than courtesy required, of conversations that shifted subtly when she entered. It was as if the air itself were tuned to the same question, waiting for a configuration of bodies that would allow it to be asked without words. She spotted Keanu across the space almost immediately, not because he was the most visible person there, but because he was the most familiar. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange was an entire conversation. No reassurance, no planning, just presence. They didn't cross the room at once. They let the evening unfold at its own pace, each of them engaging with the people who approached, honoring the purpose of the gathering rather than the curiosity surrounding it. The formal program began and guests took their seats. The host welcomed the audience, spoke about service, about compassion, about the power of example. Names were read, achievements highlighted, applause rose and fell in predictable rhythms. Keanu listened attentively, clapping when it was time, his mind focused not on what might happen, but on what was being honored. Sandra sat several rows away, close enough that he could see her when he looked, far enough that neither of them became a focal point by proximity alone. They were, for most of the program, simply two people among many who had shown up to support something beyond themselves. Then came the segment that had not been on any schedule they had seen. The host spoke about storytelling, about how narratives shape culture, about the responsibility of those in the public eye. The language was thoughtful, almost philosophical, and then gradually it narrowed. The words became more specific, more pointed. The host referenced recent conversations, recent moments that had sparked reflection. He spoke about silence, about curiosity, about how audiences seek connection. And as he spoke, cameras began to move in ways that felt less incidental. A shot of Keanu listening, a cut to Sandra applauding politely, back to the host. The rhythm changed. The room sensed it before anything explicit happened. That subtle tightening of attention, the way people straighten unconsciously when they realize something unscripted may be about to occur. The host smiled, his tone still warm, still controlled. He spoke about how public figures often become mirrors for the questions people are afraid to ask themselves. He thanked the honorees. He thanked the audience. And then he said, "Tonight has been about compassion, about courage, about honesty. And sometimes honesty simply means acknowledging what's already in front of us." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Keanu's section of the room. "Keanu," he said, "you spoke recently about love as something lived rather than named. There are many people here who found that meaningful. Would you share a little more about what that means to you?" The question was framed gently, respectfully, and yet the shift was unmistakable. The room held its breath. Keanu felt it not as fear but as weight, not the weight of expectation but the weight of responsibility. He stood slowly, not because the moment demanded drama, but because he wanted to honor it with presence. As he rose, the camera lights caught him, and with them, the faces of hundreds of people waiting not for wisdom but for direction. He could have answered in abstraction again. He could have spoken about humanity, about values, about principles without edges. And perhaps a few weeks earlier he would have. But the weeks had changed the terrain. Silence was no longer neutral. It had been repurposed. And Keanu understood now that refusing to speak could, in this moment, protect less than it allowed. He looked out over the room, taking in not just the audience, but the reason they were there. He spoke about kindness, about service, about the courage to stand beside what matters when it complicates comfort. He spoke without raising his voice, without dramatizing his words, allowing them to exist without performance. And then, almost imperceptibly, the room felt the shift, the place where abstraction meets specificity. He said that love, to him, was not a story you tell, but a way you choose. That it was present in the quiet decisions people never see, in the respect shown when no one is keeping score. And as he spoke, his gaze moved, not theatrically, not as a cue, but naturally across the space until it rested where Sandra sat. The movement was simple. The meaning was not. He did not call her name. He did not make a declaration. He did not offer the audience the neat resolution it had been craving. He did something far more disruptive to spectacle. He allowed reality to be visible without labeling it. He spoke about partnership, about mutual steadiness, about what it means to walk alongside someone without turning them into a symbol. And while his words were still addressed to the room, the way he spoke them made it impossible to miss the human direction of them. The camera followed his gaze. The audience followed the camera. And suddenly, without announcement, without orchestration, the story the world had been trying to pull from them existed plainly in the open, not as rumor, not as confession, but as alignment. Sandra felt it before she saw it on the screen behind him. She felt the way the room's attention moved like a tide. She lifted her eyes and met his. There was no surprise in her expression, no performance of emotion, only recognition. The recognition of two people who had already had this conversation in 100 private ways and were now, for the first time, letting the world glimpse its shape without permission to own it. Around them, reactions rippled. Some people smiled. Some leaned forward. Some froze, unsure of what etiquette required, when a narrative refuses to resolve on command. Keanu finished speaking not with a conclusion, but with a return. He spoke again about service, about why they were all there, about the importance of showing up for those whose lives are not debated on screens. He thanked the organization. He thanked the volunteers. And then he sat down. No announcement had been made, and yet something irrevocable had occurred. The air in the room had changed not because a secret was revealed, but because something real had been allowed to stand without disguise. The applause that followed was not explosive. It was layered. It began politely, then deepened, then softened again into something thoughtful. The program moved on, but the room did not. Conversations after the segment carried a different tone. Less speculation, more reflection. People approached Keanu and Sandra separately and together, not to extract information, but to say things that had been waiting for permission, about choosing dignity over convenience. About standing with someone when it complicates rooms. About being tired of narratives that turn human lives into puzzles for entertainment. Later, as the evening wound down and the crowd thinned, Keanu and Sandra found themselves standing near one another at the edge of the room. No photographers crowded them there. No microphones hovered. It was one of those spaces events forget to light because nothing important is supposed to happen there. Sandra looked at him, a small, knowing smile at the corner of her mouth. "Well," she said softly, "that happened." Keanu exhaled, something like relief in the sound. "It did," he replied. Neither of them felt triumphant. Neither felt exposed. What they felt was something quieter and heavier, consequence. They both understood that what had occurred could not be folded back into private life. The world had seen not a declaration, but a direction. And direction invites movement. Some would move closer. Some would move away. Some would misunderstand. Some would learn. The night had not ended the story. It had changed its posture. It had shifted it from speculation to witness. And witness, once granted, does not disappear. As they left the venue separately, as planned, as always, Sandra paused at the door and looked back once, not at the room, but at the path they had just walked. She knew now with certainty that the next phase would not be managed quietly. They had crossed from being discussed into being observed. And observation, unlike rumor, carries expectation. What they would do next, how they would continue to show up, how they would protect what mattered without turning it into spectacle would become the real story. Because the world had not been given a name. It had been given a standard. And standards are far harder to ignore. The morning after the event did not feel dramatic. There were no sudden phone calls, no urgent knocks at the door, no sense that something had exploded overnight. It felt instead like the quiet that follows a shift in weather, the air still, the light a little different, the pressure changed in ways you can't see but your body registers immediately. Keanu woke early, as he often did, and sat with a cup of coffee near the window, watching the city come into itself. He didn't open his phone right away. He didn't need to. He already knew what would be there. Sandra woke around the same time in her own space, moving through her morning slowly, aware that the day would not belong entirely to her the way some days did. The world had seen something the night before, and when the world sees, it rarely remains quiet. By mid-morning, the responses had formed their patterns. News outlets framed the moment as subtle confirmation, as quiet revelation, as a masterclass in restraint. Others called it calculated, symbolic, or deliberately ambiguous. Social feeds filled with slowed-down clips, annotated screenshots, confident interpretations layered over fragments of speech and glances. But alongside all of that, something else moved just as strongly, though with less noise. People spoke about dignity. About how rare it felt to watch two public figures refuse to turn intimacy into entertainment. About how the moment had unsettled them in a good way, as if it had reminded them of something they had forgotten they were allowed to protect. Sandra read some of those messages in the afternoon, sitting at her kitchen table, the light shifting across the surface as the day progressed. She did not feel lifted by them. She felt steadied, because what people were responding to was not a performance she had delivered. It was a way of being she had lived. Keanu experienced the aftermath differently. For him, it came in the form of conversations, some welcome, some wearying, some revealing in ways the speakers didn't intend. Colleagues reached out to say they admired how he handled himself. Some expressed relief, as if his choice had given them permission to reconsider their own. Others called with concern masked as advice, warning him about narratives, about how moments get reinterpreted, about the importance of guiding public perception. He listened to them all without argument. He thanked them. And after each conversation, he felt a little clearer about something he had already begun to accept, that he was no longer navigating curiosity. He was navigating expectation, and expectation is heavier because it pretends to know what it wants from you. That afternoon, he and Sandra met again, not to debrief the event, but because they had begun to meet regularly in this way, choosing presence over commentary. They sat across from each other in a quiet space, windows open to a breeze that carried the distant sounds of the city without intruding on the room. For a while, they spoke about small things, almost deliberately. About a book Sandra had finished. About a documentary Keanu had watched that left him thinking. About plans that had nothing to do with being seen. But beneath the ordinary conversation ran the shared awareness that something new had entered their lives. Not exposure, responsibility. The responsibility of having allowed the world to witness alignment. Sandra was the one who finally named it. "They're going to start watching what we do," she said calmly. "Not to understand us, to measure us." Keanu nodded. "They always were," he replied. "Now they just think they're allowed to." They talked then, not in hypotheticals, but in principles. About what they were and were not willing to do. About the difference between privacy and secrecy. About how to continue showing up honestly without letting that honesty be turned into spectacle. Sandra spoke about her exhaustion with narratives that demanded emotional labor from women to make public consumption more comfortable. Keanu spoke about the way kindness is often tolerated only when it is quiet, invisible, and non-disruptive. They didn't outline a strategy. They affirmed a posture. They agreed, without needing to formalize it, that if they ever spoke more clearly, it would not be to correct rumors or satisfy appetite. It would be to set a boundary the world could not blur. The test of that resolve arrived sooner than either of them expected. 3 days after the event, a long-form interview was released by a prominent publication, framed as thoughtful reflection on art, responsibility, and life. Keanu had recorded it weeks earlier, before the community center, before the gala, before the narrative had crystallized. The piece was well-written, respectful, and in most ways, true to him. But in the editing, a question had been emphasized, lifted, and positioned to become the centerpiece. It asked about love, about silence, about whether there were things he felt the public deserved to know. His original answer, thoughtful and measured, had been trimmed to its most quotable fragments. The effect was not dishonest, but it was incomplete. It removed the weight and left the outline, and into that outline rushed interpretation. The article spread quickly. Headlines distilled his words into something sharper, more provocative. Comment sections filled with certainty. Some claimed vindication, others claimed manipulation. And threaded through it all was the quiet reemergence of Sandra's name, placed beside his in ways that ranged from affectionate to invasive. Sandra read the article once, all the way through, not for the sound bites, but for the spaces between them. She recognized the person he was in it. She also recognized how easily nuance evaporates once something leaves your hands. She didn't call him immediately. She let herself feel what she felt first. The familiar mix of fatigue and resolve. The understanding that being visible means surrendering control over how visibility is used. And the certainty that control, while comforting, had never been the foundation of their choices anyway. When they spoke that evening, there was no tension between them, only alignment. Keanu told her he was considering responding, not defensively, not with a correction, but with clarity. Sandra listened, then asked the question she always returned him to. What would it protect? He thought about it. He spoke about how silence had begun to be used not as a sign of respect, but as a blank surface others felt free to write on. He spoke about how that surface was now touching her life, not just his. He spoke about how he did not want her existence to be reduced to inference. Sandra considered this, then said something quietly that shifted the frame. "Then it shouldn't be about us," she said. "It should be about the boundary." Keanu understood immediately. He wasn't being asked to tell a story. He was being invited to draw a line. They decided together to write something. Not an interview, not a reveal. A statement, short, unembellished, not a confession but a context. They didn't rush it. They took the evening, then another morning, shaping language the way people do when they know words will outlive the moment they're written in. They spoke about love not as romance but as responsibility, about partnership not as spectacle but as mutual protection. About the right of any person, public or not, to define which parts of their life exist for service and which exist for sanctuary. They did not name themselves as a couple. They did not deny what was already visible. They framed the issue larger than their own lives because they knew that if it stayed small, it would be consumed. When the statement was released, it was posted quietly on Keanu's official page and mirrored on Sandra's without preamble, without announcement. It did not trend immediately. It did not invite reaction with dramatic language. It was simply there. It spoke about how love, when real, expresses itself through consistency, care, and shared values rather than public performance. It asked for respect not as a favor but as a standard. It thanked people for their interest and support, then set a boundary around what would remain private. It ended not with a request, but with an invitation to redirect attention toward work that mattered beyond personal lives. The reaction unfolded slowly, then deeply. Some were disappointed, wanting more. Some were relieved, feeling something settle. Many were moved by the tone more than the content. It did not scold. It did not justify. It did not exploit. It spoke as if to adults. And people accustomed to being addressed as consumers recognized the difference. Commentators tried to turn it into a win or a loss, a reveal or a refusal, but those framings didn't hold. The statement didn't fit them. It didn't resolve curiosity. It reframed it. And reframing is harder to dismiss because it doesn't argue, it asks you to mature. The days that followed were quieter than expected, not silent but quieter. The frenzy lost its edge, stories shifted focus. New headlines arrived to replace the old, but beneath the surface something had changed. People began referencing the moment not as a celebrity development, but as an example. Writers spoke about it when discussing boundaries in the age of access. Advocates cited it in conversations about dignity and media ethics. Ordinary people shared it when they talked about choosing not to explain their lives to people who hadn't earned that explanation. Sandra saw her words quoted in places she hadn't anticipated, woven into conversations that had nothing to do with entertainment. She felt something unfamiliar and grounding, the sense that visibility had been used without being surrendered. Keanu felt the shift most clearly in himself. The internal tension he hadn't fully named began to ease. He hadn't won anything. He hadn't fixed anything. But he had aligned something. His actions, his words, and his values no longer sat in separate compartments. They moved together now. And that coherence carried a peace that no amount of approval ever had. He found himself more patient in conversations, less guarded in rooms, more willing to sit with uncertainty without filling it. The world had not suddenly become respectful, but it had been asked to be, and sometimes being asked is the beginning. One evening, as the light faded and the day folded into quiet, Keanu and Sandra walked together along a familiar route, neither of them in a hurry. They didn't talk about the statement. They didn't talk about reactions. They talked about a small place they wanted to visit someday, about a project that might never be made but mattered to them anyway, about the way time changes what you're afraid of. At one point, Sandra laughed at something he said, and the sound of it in the open air felt like an answer no headline could ever frame. Keanu listened, not as a man relieved of pressure, but as someone newly aware of the ground under his feet. He realized then that the world's question had been wrong from the beginning. It had asked who he loved, as if love were a thing to point at. The real question, the one life had been asking him through loss and silence and choice, was what he was willing to protect. And in choosing to protect something without hiding it, he and Sandra had done something neither dramatic nor safe. They had modeled a way of standing that did not shrink to fit curiosity and did not harden to survive it. They had not ended the story. They had changed the terms on which it could continue. And the final test would not come from cameras or commentary. It would come from time, from whether they could continue to live what they had articulated when the attention faded and only ordinary days remained. Because ordinary days are where values either deepen or dissolve. And the truest stories are not proven in moments. They are proven in years. The weeks that followed did not announce themselves as a resolution. They did not carry the dramatic closure that stories are usually given when the public believes it has been satisfied. Instead, they unfolded quietly, almost stubbornly ordinary, as if life itself were insisting on reminding the world of something it constantly forgets. That truth does not climax and exit. It stays. It settles. It becomes visible not in moments but in patterns. For Keanu and Sandra, that ordinariness was not an escape from what had happened. It was the truest continuation of it. The attention faded the way attention always does, unevenly. Some outlets moved on immediately, hungry for the next story. Others lingered, offering reflective pieces about dignity, about restraint, about the way public figures rarely redraw the boundaries that benefit industries built on access. A few voices tried to revive speculation, but it no longer landed the same way. Something had shifted. The narrative had lost its grip because it had been replaced not by a competing story, but by a standard. And standards do not generate outrage easily. They generate reflection. Reflection does not trend quickly, but it travels far. Keanu felt that shift not in headlines, but in encounters. At a small gathering supporting a youth arts program, he watched a young man approach him, hesitate, then speak with a kind of careful honesty that surprised him. The young man said he had watched the interview, the gala, the statement. He said it had forced him to rethink the way he spoke about people he didn't know. He admitted he had always felt entitled to commentary, to judgment, to access. And then he said something that stayed with Keanu long after the evening ended. He said, "You made it feel like respect wasn't optional anymore." Keanu didn't respond with a speech. He thanked him. He shook his hand. And later, alone, he sat with the realization that this had never really been about love in the romantic sense at all. It had been about permission, about whether the world could be taught, even briefly, to withdraw its hands. Sandra experienced the change in different ways. She found that conversations with women she met, whether at events or through messages she chose to open, had softened. They were less about her and more about themselves. Women spoke about learning to protect something precious without apologizing for it, about choosing not to translate their private lives into public currency, about recognizing that being seen does not require being consumed. Sandra listened to them with a quiet attentiveness that did not offer solutions, because what they were discovering did not need solving. It needed space. And she could feel in those conversations that something had taken root that was larger than her own life. Something about dignity, once demonstrated, had become contagious. Time continued. Projects resumed. Commitments returned to their natural scale. Keanu accepted work that aligned with his sense of meaning and declined what didn't, not with statements, but with consistency. Sandra moved into the rhythm of her own work, choosing stories that felt honest to her, not strategic. They did not suddenly become public companions. They did not turn what had been visible into a performance. They remained what they had always been to one another, steady, present. Available in the ways that mattered, and unavailable in the ways that preserved something real. And yet something fundamental had changed. The silence they now carried was not the silence of withholding. It was the silence of clarity. The difference between not speaking because you are protecting something fragile and not speaking because you know something is strong enough to stand without explanation. They were no longer orbiting a question. They had stepped beyond it. One evening, months later, they found themselves once again at a small community gathering. Nothing official, nothing promoted. The kind of place where people came to share food, to talk, to listen, to feel briefly less alone in a world that often isolates even in crowds. There was no stage, no host. Just folding chairs, warm light, and the hum of conversation. At some point, an older woman who had been quietly listening through much of the evening spoke up. She did not address them as celebrities. She addressed them as if they were simply two people sitting in a circle like everyone else. She said she had watched what happened earlier in the year. She said it had reminded her of her late husband, of the way he never spoke about their marriage publicly but never left her side privately. Then she said something that stilled the room in a way no camera ever had. She said, "When love is real, it doesn't introduce itself. It just shows up." Keanu felt Sandra's presence beside him, not as a focal point, but as a certainty. He felt in that moment the full arc of what had begun with a single question on a brightly lit stage. He felt how far it had traveled without ever needing to raise its voice. The room did not applaud the woman's words. It simply absorbed them. And in that absorption was the truest acknowledgement he had encountered through any of it. Later, walking out into the evening air, Sandra spoke quietly, more to the space than to him. She said, "They wanted a story." Keanu nodded. "They got a practice," he replied, and that finally felt like the right language. What the world had witnessed was not a revelation. It was a way of moving, a way of answering without performing, a way of standing that neither attacked nor surrendered, a way of loving that did not require witnesses but remained intact when witnesses arrived. The memory of the original question had faded from public conversation by then, replaced by countless others, louder, newer, easier to package. But its impact had not disappeared. It lived quietly in the places that do not announce themselves, in the way some journalists framed their work more carefully, in the way some viewers hesitated before turning private lives into public entertainment, in the way some people chose, for the first time, not to explain something meaningful to someone who had not earned it. Keanu understood now that the room had gone silent that night not because the world was waiting for his answer, but because it had encountered a limit. And limits, when expressed without anger, can feel like sudden stillness. They interrupt habits. They disrupt entitlement. They force reflection. That silence had not been empty. It had been instructive. And Sandra understood something equally important. That love, when lived with dignity, does not shrink under observation. It clarifies. It becomes less about being seen and more about being trusted. Less about announcement and more about endurance. She did not feel like someone who had been revealed. She felt like someone who had been left intact. There was no final scene, no public declaration, no closing interview to summarize what had happened. The story concluded the way real stories do, not with an ending, but with a continuation that no longer needed narration. They returned to their lives, to their work, to their conversations, to the long, ordinary days that build meaning without headlines. They disagreed sometimes. They laughed often. They carried their histories and their hopes without turning either into spectacle. The world moved on, as the world always does. But something remained. A reminder that not every meaningful question deserves a public answer. That not every truth is strengthened by exposure. That love, when it is real, does not rush toward a microphone. It moves toward responsibility. It chooses presence over performance. It protects what it values not by hiding it, but by refusing to trade it. The room had gone silent once. Not because a man was asked who he loved, but because, for a moment, the world had been shown what love looks like when it no longer asks to be believed.